Well, here we are again. Welcome to Watercolours with Caroline, and we're going to finish the painting of the Pinto horse. At least I hope we are. Let's go back to painting the horse's head, which was quite tricky to do. And when I saw this photo, I just thought it was so beautiful, and I've never painted a horse portrait, but I had to have a go. And I'm sorry it was a little bit tricky. Next time I'll pick something easier for you to paint. But even if you just want to watch, or you can paint along with me or finish the one you started the other day, I hope you enjoy it. So part 2 of the Pinto. So I promised you part 2. We are going to focus on the horse's head in this one today. Yesterday I didn't have enough time to finish this and it needed a lot of concentration. So I'm going to start from scratch with my sketch on a 6x8 piece of paper. I keep it small so we can get it done in one class, and because when I print my handouts, they print on regular size paper that we have here in North America, which is 8.5 by 11. So I can't really make my line drawings much bigger than that, or my handouts don't work for people. Of course, if you want to expand the line drawing on a scanner or a printer, you're very welcome to do that, so you can do a bigger painting. Anyway, so here's my horse ready to go, and the first thing we're going to work on is the background. Remember, we're going to make the background nice and loose. So I want a biggish kind of a brush. I'm going to get my 8 and my 10, one in each hand, ready to go, and I want cerulean blue and some grays mixed up. So we'll work on mixing those colors ready for the background. So we need some cerulean blue. That's one of the main colors. It's a lovely complement to the golden brown of the horse. Make sure your mixes are nice and wet and juicy so that you can really move them about on the paper and they don't dry up on you too quickly. I'm going to mix the cerulean blue with a little bit of burnt sienna to make it a bit more grey so that it's not so bright in places. We don't want it to shout. The background needs to fade into the background, so we don't want the colour to sort of shout and compete with the main colours. And the third grey that I'm going to mix, one of my favourites, is Cobalt Blue this time. Very soft blue, very kind of neutral blue. And I like to put a little bit of raw sienna in there. If you don't have raw sienna, just use some yellow ochre. It's very similar. And that, of course, we get a grey immediately that we put the two colours together, but I like to warm it up a little bit with some rose, Quinacridone Rose. Winsor & Newton call it permanent rose, same PB19, same colour, and that just makes a kind of a violet. Put a little bit more rose in, a bit more blue. I just want to get a sort of a violet grey that's warmer. When adding that little bit of rose makes it a little bit more towards red violet, and that just makes it a little bit warmer. So I have those 3 colours. I'm going to work on those together, one at a time, you know, alternate between one then the other. And I'm going to start up by the horse's ear. I'm working on dry paper. Sometimes I work on wet paper for a background wash, but this one I want to make it very loose, and I don't mind if I get back runs or anything like that. So I'm going to start just with the cerulean blue. And the nice thing about the dry paper is it will contain the paint. It won't go anywhere you don't want it to if the paper's dry. So you can put it on, get a nice sharp edge, and let's just zoom in a little bit so you can see a little bit better what I'm doing. There we go. And I'm going to have my other brush to wet that out so that I've got paint staying on one brush, and I've got my little sponge. I have a little sponge that I just tap my brush on to control the water and the paint. And I'm going to sort of go in like circular motions with that, the brush with the water on, and just fade that colour out into the background. A little bit more cerulean blue coming down around the eye. And of course, the area that's the dry area of the horse stays nice and crisp. And take my other brush again and just blend that out. And I'm going to switch to the second grey I made, where I added a little bit of burnt sienna to the cerulean blue. So I had to have a think about what I was doing there. Sometimes when I'm painting, it's very hard to find my words and actually tell you what I'm doing, but I keep going, sort of circular motions. And then I would like to get some of that more violet-y grey down here, and also some of the cerulean blue. Mix them together, violet-y grey, cerulean blue. Let's have a bit of a mix down here. Not worried about backgrounds. I want a watercolor look to it. I'm encouraging runs, backgrounds, all that kind of thing, because I'm not fussing with this background. It's just going to be a lovely selection of blues and greys and runbacks and everything that watercolor does so beautifully. Keep your background nice and light. I've just put a bit more water with the cerulean blue right up here. I want quite a light background. I'm going in between the two. I'm going to go get a little bit of the medium. I'm going to call the second grey I mixed up medium grey. And I'll be coming in with some black. Well, not black. I'm going to mix something close to a black for the mane at the top there. So I'm not too worried about how I come in with that colour. Blend that in. You have to be very careful that when you have a dry edge like I have up here, that you get either some paint or some water on it fairly quickly. What you don't want is that dry edge drying up before you can get to it. That's the only time you have to be a little bit fast with what you're doing. In just 1 second, I'm going to turn this around because it starts to get hard for me to get my arm up here. I like to rest my arm to give me some control when I'm painting. So I'm going to turn this whole thing around and go for my purpley blue and mix them in. Now, coming up here, we have white mane coming out into the background. So I'm going to do a little bit of that work with my brush, just poking my brush in there and making those white strands. And what I will do later, you can do too if you like, is I have some P.H. Martin's white and I'll add a few more extra strands with that. Coming along the mane is really flowing out beautifully at the back of the horse here, and we can't do a lot of that. I don't want to do it with masking fluid. Masking fluid for me just goes really clumpy and ugly, and I would rather do this either with brush control or with Dr. P.H. Martin's later. That will do for me along the back of the horse. So I've got my background on, and right up here where the top of the mane is going to come, I just want to just take my wet brush and soften that off a little bit. And I can also take my wet brush where this mane comes out, and to be careful when I do this, I can put a few little drops of water on there, and that will give some backgrounds that will give a very soft look to the mane. Just a little bit more paint in there. It does, like I say, backgrounds don't matter when I'm putting in this background. I want to encourage that to happen so I get a good variety of blends. Let's turn this around so I can see it the right way up and see how we're going. And I need, before I can do anything else really, I need that to dry, because I don't want any of my horse color moving out into the background there. So while we wait for the paint to soak in on the background, we need to let it just soak in and do its thing. We need to mix up some colors for the horse's body. So one of the first colors I want is some raw sienna. Now you can use yellow ochre if you like, just a lovely sort of light earth brown color. Another lovely color which I'm going to use is a little bit of quinacridone gold. It's very intense and it doesn't, you know, it stains, so you can't lift it off easily, so you have to be a little bit careful with it. Beautiful color for this horse is the burnt sienna. Mine is a Winsor & Newton burnt sienna. They use PR 101, which is not quite as granulating as the brown one that Daniel Smith uses, so that's a beautiful one too. I just prefer the one that is a little more clear and a little more red. This happens to be my favorite. I'm going to mix that with a little bit of red. Now you can use cadmium red or similar bright red, or I also have a Pyrrole red. They're both lovely. The Pyrrole is very intense, so I'm going to stick with a little bit of cadmium for now. Still got some cadmium left on my palette. I'm not going to throw it out just because it's a cadmium. When I have to replace it, I'll find one of the cadmium free ones. There's quite a few now. So that'll just make a little bit more of a warm chestnutty reddy brown color. And I also want to mix the two siennas, so the burnt sienna and the raw sienna, so that I have a sort of a mid brown color with the two mixing. So I've got I need a few browns to model this horse's head and body. The body's a little bit more plain. There's quite a few shadows on the head, and it'll need some going back and forth between the different browns to get the lights and the darks. Now let's get back to my grey tray over here. I have 2 trays of paint. I'm trying to keep one tray for all my warm colors and one tray for my cool colors. It's not quite transitioned yet because some of them I don't want to dig out until they're, you know, used up. I'm not going to waste paint. But for my dark brown, it's just my favorite mix. Of course, you can just dig into a dark brown like burnt umber or sepia. That's okay, but I just kind of like to stick to the same colors I'm using, so I'll use ultramarine with that burnt sienna, and I can get a range of dark browns with that. See, if I add a lot of ultramarine blue, I can get a very, very dark brown. I'm just going to clean. I use just a little sponge to quickly clean up a bit of a mixing tray. I have lots of mixing trays, but when I'm filming, I just don't have space on my table for a whole bunch of them here. I have a very small space filled with lights, cameras, and all kinds of things. Not enough room for paint. So I'm going to mix another one that's not quite as dark, just a little bit of ultramarine blue. So I've got a darker brown than just the burnt sienna, but not quite as dark as the one with the ultramarine blue. And I still have my warm grey mix here. That was the cobalt and the raw sienna and the rose. I'll use some of that to put a little bit of shadow on the white, and I might need a little bit of cerulean blue to put some shadow on the white too. I'll go back and forth. I'll tell you what I'm doing as I go back and forth, so you'll keep track. I have to just remember what I'm supposed to do and get my paint here ready, and then I will completely dry off the horse and we'll get back to painting. There, I have used my hairdryer to dry that off. I'm not a big fan of using the hairdryer for a few reasons. One is the paint needs a little bit of time to settle into the paper and finish blending. The second is when you have half of your paper wet and half dry, the hairdryer dries it very unevenly, very fast, and it will shrink part of it and leave part of it unshrunk. And then you get, even if you've got tape on it, you get a bubbling happening when one part shrinks faster than the other. And the other thing is it melts the tape, so it will pull away from the tape and shrink even more. And then no matter what you do, you get a wavy, bubbly paper. So I prefer, if I'm not filming, to just leave it to dry naturally, and that way you get a much flatter piece of paper when you're finished. Of course, if you want to keep your paper flat, you need to tape it. And if you have paper that's any bigger I stretch mine. I wet both sides. I tape it down with gum paper. I make sure it's properly stretched. But not for these little ones that we do in class. I don't need to do that. This is enough, just some tape. Right, so I have my mixes here of paint, and I'm going to start with the one I've got in the middle one here. I've got the burnt sienna mixed with some red, cadmium red. Sorry, I had to think about that. And I'm going to just do these two spots on the back of the horse that are pretty just plain painting. They don't need much fuss, and I'm going to use my number 6 brush. I use mostly silver black velvet. They're just, I love them. I've been using them for years and years and years. I'm used to how they paint. They've lasted me for absolutely years. So I'll just put this, you know, I'm very bad at smudging paint on things. That's, you know, that paper towel's dirty, so not even a good idea to put that there. Up the other way, Caroline. There we go. Right, so I'm going to go in and just paint in the back. And when I want to put a lot of paint down, I flatten my brush down, but when I want to come up to a lovely point where this white coat comes up to the chestnut color, I lift my brush up and I use just the point of the brush to do that. And what I find with these silver black velvets, which are a squirrel and synthetic mix, is that they hold tons and tons of paint, and they're really good at either being a nice big juicy brush or coming up to a beautiful lovely point. And one of my number 8 I've had for I think about 25 years, and it's still good. I bought a new number 8 recently just because it was getting a little bit frayed at the end. So, but it's still pretty good. I'd save it for doing not such detailed work. And we've got those 2 little bits in. I won't fuss with those again. They're going to just stay like that. They won't need changing. Now I want to get my reference photo and my first painting. So this is the reference photo by Denise McQuillan. Beautiful, beautiful photographer, and she has her work on the Facebook group, Free Reference Photos for Artists, and I've written to her and made sure that she's okay with me using them. So what we need to really focus on with this, I'm going to get this great big part of the chest in here. We need some nice light paint here and in some of the highlights, and then a lot of the medium brown and this very dark shadow. I will do that when everything else is dry. And if I look at the photo, it's a little bit dark on the back, but I'm not going to fuss with that part on the back. I think we'll just leave it and focus on the face. So I'm going to do that big part of the chest first. Put that photo somewhere. Get my other painting beside me just to remind me what I'm supposed to be doing. And remember, work with wet paint. Don't work with dry paint. Work with a big brush if you're doing big areas. And don't let the paint dry before you go back and, you know, put some more paint on. Otherwise you'll get hard edges and lines where your paint is dried. The way to avoid that is to work on wet paper, but I want a bit more control, so I don't want to work on wet paper at the moment. So I'm putting the raw sienna first in the lightest places, which is a little bit over on this side of the body and a little bit here. Now that I've put that wet paint on, I have to get the rest of the paint on before that dries. I can't wait around. And I'm going to use the mix, so that the mix of burnt sienna and raw sienna. Now, watercolor, you go light to dark. You start with the lightest colors and you gradually move to the darker colors, either working wet in wet, or you can work in layers, which means you can come back. Now I have to make sure I get right up to that light paint before it dries. Remember what I said? If you leave it too long, you'll have a nasty dry edge, and you can't really get rid of those dry edges. They show through everything. That's why I don't like masking tape, because masking tape gives you some really hard dry edges, and if you haven't masked well, if you've made a bit of a mess of it, those hard dry edges that your masking tape leaves, they just never go away. You always see them and it's frustrating. And I find it's goopy stuff and hard to get nice fine lines with. But I don't like it. Sometimes I use it sometimes if I really, really need to. Now I'm going to get some of the, pull my palette over. I don't want my palette too close because I really need to rest my wrist to paint properly, but I want you to see what I'm getting. I'm getting some of the burnt sienna. And up here by the head, I'm just, with the tip of my brush, just dropping that in. You don't paint it in. You literally just let it drip off of your brush. And a little bit here. And remember, if you join the Facebook group, Free Reference Photos for Artists, which is very easy, you just go on Facebook and request to join. I think you have to maybe answer a couple of questions. You can go and get all these photos for yourself. You can download them. They're beautiful photos, so many beautiful photos on there for reference material. You're allowed to use them for painting your pictures. You're even, as long as you don't include the photo in your artwork, you're allowed to sell your paintings. It's a very great group. And of course you can message the people just to make sure that you're using their work the way they would like. For instance, me doing a YouTube video, I like to check that that's okay with them. But the one thing I am not allowed to do, which is very fair, is I'm not allowed to print that photograph in my handout. So that's what I print where you can get the photograph from, so that you can go get it for yourself. Now all of this shouldn't be touched anymore. It needs to just soak into the paper, work wet in wet. And what I need to be very careful of, and you too, is if you have wet paint on your tape, just clean it up a little bit, because it can flood back into your picture and give you an unintentional background. I'm using my brush, just suck a little bit of paint up from that corner so that doesn't happen. I can do a few things on the dry face while I'm just waiting for all that to soak in. Of course, I have to be very careful I don't plant my wrist in the wet paint. But the nose has this lovely little soft pink diamond on it. And so do the lips, but the lips are too close to do it. And that is just some raw sienna with a little tiny bit of rose, Quinacridone Rose, added to it. So I have my raw sienna here, and I'm going to grab a little bit of Quinacridone Rose just on the corner. Now when you've got a palette with paint on, you don't have to mix the whole load of paint with another color. You can just go to the corner like this, and I've just put in a little bit of rose in that corner, and I'm going to just, with my number 6 brush, probably should have switched to a number 4, but maybe I know what I do. I switch to a number 2 when I'm talking about that. Like I say, it's very, very tricky to talk and paint at the same time. You're using two parts of the brain that don't get along when you're creating, so I struggle with that sometimes. So I've got that little fleshy rosy color, and I'm going to put that little sort of diamond shape in on the nose, and then the top of the nostril. The nostrils are so big on this Pinto that I guess they're flared open because there's lots of pictures of it cantering around the paddock. So its nose is wide, wide open. Nostrils way, way bigger than the eyes, look. Now the blaze down the front is white, so we'll try and leave white paper very carefully. The eyebrows are sort of a grey colour with white highlights on. I call them eyebrows. It's kind of like the big part that sticks out over the eye, like the brow bone. So they are very definitely shaped, and they have highlights on. So there's a lot of things to work on the face. What I can do is up here, it's quite dry, so I can put in the ears at this point, being very careful not to smudge the face, of course. Now let's have a look at how that goes. I'm going to just put that out the way for a second, because I'm really good at smudging. So we've got to remember that Let's zoom in a little bit so you can see. This, it's interesting, this horse has a black mane at the front, which goes to beautiful white, creamy white at the back. But across this face and across the ear, we're going to mix a very, very dark brown grey that looks black, and we're going to bring that across the face. But of course there is an ear behind that, so we've got to try and put that ear in softly so that we don't again have a hard edge, and we can get that mane going across the front of it. And there's a very light area in this mane too. And if I was doing a much bigger picture, I would paint that in with a very light grey, but it's a small picture. And we're going to use some Dr. P.H. Martin's white or a white pencil at the end just to put that in. Makes it easier. But if you want, if you want to do a bigger picture and you want to paint that light grey, please go ahead and do what works for you. Just letting you know kind of why I'm going to be a little bit careful as I go behind that mane. So the ears are quite a dark brown, so I'm going to, remember I mixed over here, I mixed a dark brown and a medium dark brown. So I'm going to move a bit of that paint tray out of the way. Make sure you can see what's happening, and I want some room to get my hand down carefully. So the inside of this ear is fairly light, so I've got that kind of raw sienna. I'm just going to put that on to start. I don't mind that this is all going to be wet and wet. And then I'm going to get that medium brown that I made, and we'll put, just getting a little bit more water on my brush so that I can make the paint flow well. Start right at the tip of this ear. And remember that blue background has to be nice and dry before you attempt this. Otherwise, this ear will just flood into your blue background. Or if it's almost dry, it will make some kind of a very nasty, weird, wet against wet line there. Now I'm sort of painting a little bit in between where that mane is going to come across. I've got my number 2 brush at the moment, want a little bit of control. Over the years I've bought myself lots of silver black, about 1 a year brushes, until I've got a very good set going on. And the ear of course comes down here under this mane. I'm going to put that in as well. And if I put those kind of like lines going through the mane, then I'm not going to get any weird, weird sort of shapes that aren't going to look nice when I come over with the mane. Now that's the medium brown of the ear. Now the top of the ear, the tips of the ear are quite dark. So wet and wet, I'm just going to add a little bit of dark at the tip. Now I may have to come back later and put a bit more on, but I'm just going to add some to the tip of the ear, and I'll have to wait for most of it to dry before I can sort of model the inside of the ear. But that's that one. Now let's look at this ear. This ear has some lovely light patches on it, so we're going to put those in first with the raw sienna and burnt sienna mix, the 2 colors together. It's not a really, really light raw sienna, but it's fairly light. And I don't want ugly lines. Again, I don't want my lines to be somewhere where they're going to really show up. So I'm going to take that ear down the side of the face and along the edge of the mane, so that if it dries on me, which it will, I'm not going to have some weird line that I've got to deal with. Now I'm going into the medium brown, which is the burnt sienna with a bit of ultramarine blue in it, to work my way up the ear. The horse's coat is so soft and silky, and the way to get that soft sort of silky look is to always have wet in wet happening. Now you can have wet in wet happening on dry paper, that's fine. You see what I mean? My paint is wet and then I'm painting into it with wet paint. I'm going into the darkest brown. I mix with lots of ultramarine blue for the tip of the ear. And I want all those 3 blends of colour to mix wet in wet so that they're soft. And around the base of this ear and around here, there are some dark areas. I use the dark brown for that. Might need a little bit more later. And then on the side of the head, just behind this mane, it's a little bit darker. And sometimes you have to wait a little bit for your wet paint to dry up just a tiny bit before you put the next paint in. And the next paint you put in can't be too wet. You have to be careful not to go too wet with your second layer of paint going wet in wet. Now I want to put a little shadow down the center of that patch, but that's not going to happen when the paint is this wet. It will disappear. So I'm going to have to put that on later. Again, I'll have to put it on when this layer is dry. And at any point, if your paint starts to blend too much wet in wet, you can use what's called a thirsty brush, which is a brush that's damp, dried off on your paper towel, and you can do a little bit of lifting. The colours I've used, the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue, lift really, really nicely. So you don't have to worry about them. They don't stain. The Quinacridone gold really stains. I didn't use any of that, did I, on the body? I used it on the other horse. That's why I was thinking about mixing it. So see, we've got quite a bit of the horse put on there. Another thing we could do, I'm just going to move my horse up a little bit and bring this picture over. On the side of the body, on the white here, there's some shadow. So we can use our grey mix. I like to use the pinky grey mix. I'm going to go to my number 6 brush. And don't forget to mix a lot of water in with your grey when you're painting shadows on white, because you can darken it up later if it gets too dark. So I want to put that shadow on here. There's sort of a fold in the horse's body, not body, in its skin. And when there's a lovely soft fold like that, you need to get a clean brush and just, with my clean, slightly damp brush, and just easing that shadow in. Now, as I come up the body, I want to have a slightly cooler shadow. So that's going to be the cerulean with a little bit of the raw sienna. And that's just over here. And again, wet brush. Just soften that in so we don't have any hard edges happening with that shadow at all. And there's a little bit here too. Again, wet brush, soften that in. Now there's a darker fold. We got a little bit of just raw sienna. A little bit of just raw sienna for here and here. It's really, really subtle. Nothing on the back. I want that to be really pure white. It's fairly warm, fairly warm and dark, the shadow in the corner there. I'm just putting a little bit more of that warm grey in there. And I'm not sure, it might be, it's not that wet. I don't think. We could put a little bit of that extra shadow up here. It's fairly pinky warm, that shadow. I'm adding a little bit more rose to my mix for that. Softening it a little bit with my wet brush. I got some hair on there. Let's lift that out. Now, any shadows like that are going to look quite dark when the rest of the horse is light. But once we get a lot of the face and the dark browns and everything in, you're not going to notice some of those really light shadows. The other place where the shadow is this white mane under here. So that is a lot of raw sienna with maybe a little bit of cobalt and maybe a little bit of rose in that. Just the one that we've been mixing, but it maybe have to be a little bit more raw sienna-y. Yeah, I have it right here, and I go back and forth, sometimes adding a little bit of rose, sometimes adding a little bit of raw sienna. Always adding some water because I don't want to be too dark with it. I want it nice and light. And going back to my number 4 and number 2 brush, and that very light mix, I added a little bit more raw sienna to it. And I'm going to have some of that mane that's coming out from, I want some of it white, so I don't want to have all of it painted, but it's definitely shadowed against the face here. I'm going to bring some of that out, and it's kind of curling along the back. Just looking at where it is coming to, about there. Just that little bit of shadow, and it was nice and dry up there, so I could put that in just fine. Now I've got it up the right way. I can see where the neck is for the horse. The neck comes just right here. So be careful with that, because you need to get the neck, find the neckline and put it in the right place. And obviously when you've got a line drawing, sometimes you lose track a little bit. And there's some reflections from, just some reflections from that. I'm gonna go put a little bit more rose in my mix. Go to my little tiny brush. Number 2. 2 is my smallest one in this series. And right here, those shadows are fairly rosy. I'm going to, there, I think they're a shadow cast by the mane. And then the shadows that come out here are much darker. They are much more bluey color. So I'm gonna mix some cobalt in with that mix. Same 3 colors, cobalt, raw sienna, and rose. Just adding either more cobalt blue or more raw sienna or more rose, depending on whether the shadows look bluish or red pinkish or more raw sienna. Now there's a shadow that comes down here. And these shadows are thrown by the sun on the mane. So this is not the mane, it's shadows of the mane on the horse's back. I'm going very carefully because I want to put those on and not fuss and not have to take them off either. They're quite dense right near the neck. They come all the way down here. They kind of help form the horse's neck. And I'm just looking at my reference photo so that I get it happening, just kind of the correct shape. I have a liner brush, which some people also call a rigger brush, same kind of thing. And I'm going to use that brush to bring out some really, really delicate lines. Beautiful. This is a 2/0 Princeton Velvetouch. It's if I'm not using silver black velvet, Princeton are my second favorite brushes. I really love them, and most of their brushes are synthetic, so if you don't want to harm any animals or squirrels or anything, then Princeton make a lot of good brushes you would love, I'm sure. So what I'm doing with this thin liner brush is I'm sort of getting the very thin end of the shadows. And then I'm just going to put I'm going to get a tiny bit more blue on my brush. I'm just going to drop a tiny bit more blue in there. You have to be careful because it's just getting so it's drying up, and I can't add much more in the way of darker paint. So, and don't forget, if your paint dries up and it's too dry to work with, you just let it dry and then go in with a second layer. You don't have to get it all in at once and feel like, oh my goodness, I missed the point where I can get the paint in. Just go back, do it another time. Got a little bit of raw sienna now, and I'm putting a few more extra shadows in with my thin brush. The mane is kind of I think the very fun part to do. Really fun. I'm just touching gently with my finger the body to see if it's dry enough to put a little bit of pink lips in there. I try not to put my fingers on the paper too much because your fingers have oil in, and you can put oil on your paper and that will resist the paint, and then sometimes you can get like a finger mark, but you know, I break the rules sometimes and just check if something's dry enough to do a bit more painting. I'm just putting those very soft pink lips on, and just around the edge of the nostril, a little bit there. It's quite light up here. The place that's most difficult to paint is the horse's head. Actually, I'm going to put a little bit of pink here because underneath the brown that is going on these lips, that is pink showing through. So I've got a very dry brush now, and I'm dragging it around that muzzle and putting a little bit of pink in there that's going to show through the brown that will go on later. Also putting a little bit of pink. The nostrils are kind of light on the edges, so I'm going to put a little bit of pink in the nostrils and take stock of what I've done and think, oh, don't put your fingers on there. You shouldn't really put your fingers on there. Not a good idea. It's going to just strengthen up that line where the neck is there. Just a little bit more paint. So I'm going to take stock and maybe make sure I dry this off with a hairdryer. If I wasn't doing a demo, I'd just go away for an hour, make a cup of tea and come back when it was dry. But I want to speed things up, so I'll do a little bit of hair drying. Right, I've dried that off so that I can work on it without worrying, and we're going to go work on the face. For me, this is big deep breath and it's quite tricky. We got to remember to keep the nice light areas on the face, and then we've got to model very softly these medium and dark browns to get the shape of the face, and it's quite tricky. You need to have the reference photo. If you can download that for yourself or have it on your iPad to look at, it's really important to focus on where the darks and the shapes of the face are. I'm going to start by putting in raw sienna as a base color for the light colors. And I have to remember that I've got to keep the white down the middle of the face, and I'm not going to paint the eye sockets because I want to do those with grey and white and a little bit more care. So it's so easy when you're doing this to forget to leave the center white. And that's where, if you like to use the masking fluid, if that helps, it's maybe a good place to use it down the center. I just don't like it. I'm trying to train myself to just paint around the white. Once you train yourself, it comes easier, but you do have to be careful to remember to leave the areas that you don't want to paint. So I'm going a little bit quiet. Not because I've forgotten you there, but because I really, really have to concentrate when I'm doing this, or I will forget to leave those light areas or white areas. And as I go side to side, I must remember, like, you know, don't leave any wet paint to dry. Don't leave any dry edges. They'll go hard. And you know, if you don't go side to side picking them up, you'll have a hard edge, which will be difficult to get rid of. As we come down close to the nose, muzzle, I guess it's called, it's got quite a lot of white in it, and I found doing that afterwards with a chalk pencil was so much easier than trying to paint that all in with a paintbrush. Especially, I mean, again, I'm working on trying to leave the white, but it was really, really tricky. So I'm going to leave it white for now. Also, as the hair comes into this little blaze on the front of the head, you can see the hairs, you know. So I'm doing just a little work with the tip of my brush, and I'm going to do more work with the brown when I do that, the dark brown. But we got the main light color in, which is a good thing. Let's get my number 8 brush, and I'm going to go back to my medium and dark brown paint. Remember, I've got the Ultramarine Blue and the Burnt Sienna. And I have to decide, is the paint at the top of the head still wet enough to put in a little bit of dark? You have to be careful, because if it's just slightly damp, you're going to get some rather unpleasant fuzzy lines rather than nice soft lines. So I'm just testing the waters. That seems like it's getting close to being too dry. And I'm getting a slight fuzzy line, but the horse has got fuzzy fur, so I can work with that just gently with the tip of my slightly damp brush. Just ease that in and get a little bit more of the just burnt sienna on its own. And I'm going to see if I can get this side of the head in before we lose the wet. This is just burnt sienna here. I'm going into the very dark brown while that burnt sienna is wet, and adding a little bit of that rich dark brown along the edge. I'm going to use one of my brushes to just move that carefully around. There's also that little dark spot in here, and a bit of a dark spot up here too, and some dark on the ears. And I'm going to do with that dark brown while I've got my little brush in my hand. And again, with a slightly damp brush, I have to ease that colour in so it's not too harsh. And it will look harsh when you first put it down, but as it starts to dry, it softens. Tips of the ears are very, very dark, so I'm going to go in with that dark brown on the tips and down the edge. It's quite dark on the edge. And then with my slightly damp brush, just soften that in. The softening is the key on this. Softening with a brush that's not wet. You don't be dripping water on your painting. Just slightly damp. Now the inside of this ear I was unable to model when it was too wet, but I can come back now with the dark brown, and the edge has quite a dark brown edge to it. And I can come and put in some modeling on that ear. Now when I go back with the damp brush, I have to be very careful that I don't take away too much of that colour. I'm just gently easing it in. You have to take most of the moisture off on a cloth or a Kleenex tissue. I'm trying to say 4 words at once. I'm trying to say kitchen towel, tissue, or Kleenex all at once. But you know, one of those things that sucks up your water on your brush is good. Now I've got a very, very dry brush. That means I've dabbed the brush in the paint, and I've got this wet sponge here, and I've dabbed it on there, and I've got a paper towel in my hand. You literally can't paint without a paper towel or something in your hand. And it's still too wet. I'm dragging I just want to drag that over that ear as to give a little bit of like fur texture to it. Let me zoom in. Let's see if you can see what I mean. Just dragging it over that ear, and it just gives it a little bit of fur texture. The same, it might be too wet to do it on here, but no, it is too wet. You don't get the same dry brush texture if it's wet, but it's much darker over the eyebrow, and it's a little bit of a sort of a frown in the face there, a bit of shadow from the mane, and we can put those in. And you see why I didn't have time to do the horse's head the other day. There is so much little detail and waiting for paint to dry as you do the horse's head. And modelling, and you can't model with a damp brush if your paper is still slightly damp. Again, I've reached a point now, I don't know if you can see right here, the paint is creeping into the slightly damp paint and making that ugly edge that I don't want. I want soft edges or hard edges, but not ugly edges. So before that really gets ugly, I'm getting my damp brush and I'm wiggling that out, and I'm going to dry this off with a hairdryer and do some damage control before that gets away from me. Okay, so give me a minute to dry that off. Okay, so we are dried off, and while the head of the horse is sort of just waiting for me to get busy and back to it, I want to get this big shadow in under the head, down the neck, and some shadow under here where the leg and I guess the shoulder meets the horse. This is a hard shadow here, so that means we're not going to soften in the edge of this one, but we are going to soften in here where it's, if you can see, it's much softer. So I'm going to use my brown that's ultramarine and burnt sienna, and my number 8 brush, probably my favorite, my number 8 brush for this size painting anyway. And we have to figure out where this starts. Let's just zoom in a little bit here. I want you to see, but not be too close. So it starts right here, kind of curves around here. I want to get my smaller brush as I get up close to the face, because I'm worried my bigger brush is going to go over the edge of this face, and I don't want that to happen. It's too important a line for me to go over it accidentally. Also, the whole shadow, although you don't see much of it, it does come up there. I'm going to put that in that line. Go back to my number 8 brush, and the shadow comes down here in a kind of a very gentle curve, and then out here. And if you're working on this to get a nice flat shadow wash, you got to work fairly quickly, working on dry paper and big brush, carefully but quickly, because if you take too long, your paint's going to dry and you'll have streaks and hard edges, and you don't want that. You want to get this on all in one go, no streaks, no edges. I'm going to go back to my little tiny number 2 brush, just to, the shadow comes down from here a bit more, a bit around there, just to get it close to the nostril and get the side of the face, so that I get the right clean edge there. It looks harsh, doesn't it? But once you get the rest of the dark in, you won't notice it as much. It looks harsh when nothing else is dark. Now, there's the shadows around the shoulder, but they are much softer. It sort of comes in here and around here. And I'm going to the mid brown now, the not quite as dark brown. I want to sort of a transition to not quite as dark. Wet my brush, get a wet brush to soften this transition in. So I just have to work slowly, 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 softening this in and going between the wet brush and the, comes over a bit more actually. I'm looking at my reference material and going with my medium brown, using it up against that area to soften that in. Wet brush. Don't let any of, if you're going back with a wet brush, you can't wait. You have to go back pretty quickly, otherwise your dry lines will be dry. And there's a little bit of, the shadow comes sort of around here and around here. It's a bit of a back and forth dance between wet brush, wet paint, dry paint, softening. These are a little bit soft. And then we kind of got the shoulder shape in there. And if you have wet paint on, you can also add a little bit more wet paint once you've got the wet paint on, as long as it hasn't dried too much, to give yourself a bit more modeling. There's a sort of a rippling in the horse's skin there too, so you can have a little bit of rippling with your brush strokes. And I don't want to fuss too much with that anymore because I'll get too many weird runs and so forth. So we've done that, and we just put that out of the way for a moment and think about where we're going with everything. When I did this one, whoops, let's get it on the camera, I put a bit more dark around this edge so that the white edge of the horse showed up. So I'm going to get one of my greys, one that's got quite a bit of cobalt in it. And on this white side of the body, I want to have a bit more dark there so that the white shows up. Don't want to touch any of that wet paint that I've got on the horse, of course. And I can't leave that hard edge, that would be awful. So before that dries or anything happens to it, I'm going to soften that out with my wet brush, kind of doing wiggly strokes. And you just have to remember, don't touch any wet paint when you're doing that. There's a little bit of wet paint down there, so I've got to be very careful not to do that. If later I wanted to put a bit more dark across the back, I can do that too, but I want to get all the mane in first before I do that. Just wanted to make sure that that white edge to the body showed up well. I could also, where there was a bit of a crease in where I guess the front leg and shoulder meet, there's kind of a crease there. I can put a bit more colour in there. And soften it off a little bit with some water. And then we can come back to the horse's head, which is dry enough to work on. And this, for me, this is the hardest part of the whole horse, is modeling this head really gently and softly and carefully to get the good shape of the horse in there. And I've got all my browns sitting here, all my brushes to choose from, and deep breath, because I find this really tricky. And I think if I was working on bigger paper, it would probably be a lot easier, I have to say. So I'm taking one of those medium browns, which is burnt sienna with a tiny bit of ultramarine blue to darken it up, and even a little bit of red to richen it up. Got it nice and rich. And I'm going to start with this side of the face, under this eye. Come down here. I've got a hair on my brush. Grab that off of there. So I'm coming down under the eye, around this side of the face. And it's pretty dark as it comes around the eye here. It's kind of a lemony type shape in the eye. And we're coming down this side of the face. There's more modeling to put in after I put this color on, but we're going to get the slightly darker color on first. It transitions to light right here, so wet brush, transition right there. And comes around here. it gets a bit lighter. Wet brush to lighten it up. Thing to remember is you can go back in and put more darks in after you get this in, but you can't really go back and get the lights. So focus on the lights and go back and do the darks when you've got all this sorted out. What I want is the light as it comes down towards the nose. I don't want to lose that light. And there's a little kind of a shadow here. There's definitely a shadow as it comes down here. I'm still working like wet on wet. Washing out my brush and just got some really clean water over here, and always soften, soften, soften. So we need to get a little bit more of the brown modeling in on the face, and then the very dark details like the nostrils and the mane. The final details take the longest usually because they're a little bit more finicky. Now let's just zoom in a little bit on the face so you can see what I'm doing. Don't want to get too close, because sometimes I go out of shot when it's a bit too close. Now we want some of the dark brown. That's the burnt sienna with the ultramarine, and I like to have a variety. Same two colours, burnt sienna and ultramarine, but some of them with more burnt sienna, some of them with more ultramarine. I'm just mixing up a little bit more here. I don't like to have my tray too close to the painting because I always splash the painting. I have to be a little bit careful. And make sure you always get enough water in your paint. If your paint's too dry, you're not going to get it to flow onto your paper properly. Now it's just going to be a back and forth with a combination of these two. So I've got one tray with just burnt sienna, one tray with burnt sienna and ultramarine, and then I'm sort of going to modify back and forth between the two. I can't have them too close because I need a bit of space to work. That we'll see how we go anyway. So I'm going to pick up my number 4 brush to start, and I want to come down the head with the darker brown. So the one darkest one I've just mixed up. If it's too dark, I'll just go in and add a little bit more water or a little bit more burnt sienna and work with that. So I'm going to work really slowly when we get to this part, because I want to bring the fur into that white with little tiny brush strokes, and just really gently work my way around what I need to be doing here. Now as I come up to this side of the head here, I'm going to the burnt sienna to get a little bit more, just very warm. I'm going to even add a little bit of the cadmium red to that to warm it right up for this area. And then wet brush, I'm going to blend those two areas together with a wet brush and gradually come down. Now I'm going to get my little tiny number 2 brush, and I want to come in to this area with the teeny tip of that brush and make a little bit of texture in here, because in the photo you can see that brown fur hair, whatever you call it, coat on a horse, is coming into that white part in little tiny hairs. And down this side of it here, it's quite dark. I'll come down here with the dark, change the shape a little bit, and take a little bit of the paint off my brush. I'm just going to ease that wet paint in with a brush that's hardly wet at all. And on this side, ease that fur, I never know whether to call it fur or hair or whatever it's called, out. There's a very light spot coming down that side of the nose there. It's almost white reflections on that fur. Now right by the eyebrow here, I'm going to get a little bit more ultramarine blue into my brown. Right by the eyebrow is a very dark sort of triangle just up here. And also coming down just here. You have to be very sort of precise once you get to these little details. And around the eye is quite dark. Going a little bit darker around the eye than I had it before. Taking it up a little bit darker. And then I've got my, get my number 4 brush, just clean brush, a little bit damp. And again, I'm going to use that damp brush just to soften these edges in. And soften that in. A little bit of that reddy brown, just to come down here. And because I'm going to put a little bit of darker brown right here. So it's kind of like sculpting this part. You're sort of starting to sculpt in the places where you have shadows going in. And to make sure that the coat looks smooth, you need to use your wet brush to just ease those colours in. A little bit of reddy brown here. Now we've got a little bit more. I want to go into, what I'm doing now is I'm going to take a little bit of this darker brown, a little bit of this just burnt sienna, and I'm going for a slightly reddier brown coming down here. Coming down this side here. And then wet my brush. And again, I have to use my just wet brush to soften this in. And it's quite light as it comes down to the nose here. Again, those little tendrils. And it's quite a reddy brown. I have some. Remember right at the beginning I mixed cadmium red with burnt sienna. I have some of that over there, and I'm going to go into that just for this part of the nose. And get a little bit of that reddy brown on there. And there is all this white on the nose, so that's tricky. Go into my little number 2 brush. Get to the tricky parts now. Deep breath. Always take a deep breath when I'm getting to the tricky parts. It seems to make it a little bit easier. So it's kind of, and I'm going to have to put some of this white in afterwards, because literally it is so hard to keep the whites in a painting this small. Really is. And as it comes around the nostril, it's a fairly dark brown. So go with the ultramarine and burnt sienna. Or if you want, if you want to use a burnt umber or something like that, that's fine. You go right ahead. If you're more comfortable using a brown that you have in your paint palette, one that you enjoy. All we're doing is I'm mixing up a little bit more. All we're doing is switching to a nice dark brown for around the nose. And I'm using a number 2 brush because I have to really, really be careful here to get around this little triangle of pink and get very close to the nostril. And there's that pink lip. Now, you have to be so careful when you're wetting areas this small. And if I just really, I've got very small brush, very little water on it. I'm just going to wet that area. So when I come up to it, I hope to get a little bit of a softer edge. The danger is when you wet something this small, it just floods into what you want to keep a nice and light pink, and you kind of lose your pink edge to the lip. That's the beauty often of working with bigger paper. But I'm gently coming around there. The bottom lip is sticking out from under that top lip. I'm just putting in the parts of that bottom lip here. And the, of course the nostril goes around. We'll deal with the nostrils in a minute. Yeah, and can't do more than one thing at a time. You totally get lost. And that's where you kind of forget that you're painting a horse and you're just painting areas of shapes, really. Just you're painting shapes. And there's some dark brown that comes up this side. And literally what I'm doing right now is I'm just looking at it as a series of shapes here that need painting. I see this shape is brown and this shape is brown. And up here just above all of this is brown. Little tiny brush, number 2 brush, and get all that in. And then wet brush to just soften it here where I've come up to the lighter part of the nose. Clean wet brush and soften that in. And with that same clean wet brush, I'm going to just soften this up into here. Because some of it's not white, it's kind of a, you know, that I'm getting water all over everything now. It's that sort of soft, light brown. And I'm going to suck a little bit of the brown up here, because it's not quite as dark, just under that little pink triangle. It's not quite as dark. I just let the brown soak in, and then when it starts to soak in and dry, just suck a little bit up. Now, like I said, I use a pastel pencil afterwards to just do a little bit of white pastel or pink pastel, just to ease all of this in. And that's always a handy little tool to use. The other thing, you can do a little bit of washing back too. Right here where I've lost a little bit of the light, when this is dry, I have to wait till it's dry, I can do a little bit of washing back and get it so it's a little bit lighter. Now I'm going to work on the right side. So I'm just going to wet this a little bit so it's not too hard. And get the dark brown. And we're going to go on this side of the white. Putting the dark brown in this side now. And again, you put the brown in and then get your little teeny weeny brush and pull a little bit of it into that white. Little tiny brush strokes. And the shadow comes down here. Quite dark coming down this side. And then with my number 6 brush, I'm just going to add a little bit more of that reddy brown to this side of the head. And it's going to mix the two, burnt sienna, the dark brown, and we're going to go down this side. And then I don't want that hard line that I've got there. I have to keep a really good eye on my paint, because if it gets too dry, I'm not going to get rid of that hard line. So I have to go in with my wet brush and just soften that edge off so that it flows in nice and soft. And once you've softened with a wet brush, you can add a little bit more dark or pull a little bit of paint up. I'm getting a little bit of that red and burnt sienna. It's kind of a reddish brown. It's very different browns if you really look at if you go on and look at the reference photo on Facebook. The browns vary a lot. Even this ear now I'm seeing very reddy brown there. And just soak up a little bit of that light. The other thing I noticed, I'll get my bigger number 8 brush. The other thing I noticed was the coat on this shoulder is quite a bit darker reddish brown too. So let's get the burnt sienna, the cadmium red, a little bit of ultramarine blue, and just add a bit more reddy brown to this side of the coat. As you can see, I'm going right over the shadow too, because I don't want an awkward line between the shadow I made and the wash I'm putting on here. Now, I'm going to use a sort of a dry brush scrape, because you can actually see the texture of the coat. So I sort of took a bit of paint off my brush, dabbed it off so it's quite dry, and just dragging my brush in the direction of the horse's coat, kind of like this. And anytime you have wet paint like that, you can go in with a little bit more paint. Just drop it in. I like to go really close to areas where there's something overlapping. You know, the head is overlapping the neck, so where we have an overlapping edge, it gets very dark. So I like to, I'm just adding a little bit of like very strong ultramarine mixture in while that's wet, just where the head meets the neck, to get that nice dark division. And also, as this paint starts to dry, but is not completely dry, I can go in and add a little bit more dark on here too. You can't add it in when the paint's too wet, but you can add it in as it really starts to dry, and you'll get a little bit of soft shadow coming down the face. And I'm going to attempt that dry brush for fur texture here too. has to be pretty dry as you drag. And you don't have to do that if you feel that's a little bit too challenging at this point, and just leave what you had and work with what you had. And I noticed that my first painting that I did had a much deeper shadow right here. I'm going to put a little bit more of my grey mixture in there to just deepen that shadow a little bit. That was quite dark on the reference photo. And softening off one edge of that with my wet brush. So we're really getting there with the horse's head. And we have the, I think we'll work on the eyebrows. Let's look at the reference photo. The eyebrows are quite dark, but they also have some light in them. So I want the dark brown, and I want to keep some light patches, or I'm going to have to put some light patches on afterwards. Though it's quite grey, and if you want to, you could add some Payne's grey. Now I'm going to make an ultramarine and burnt sienna mix that's quite strong, and then I can add a little bit of Payne's grey to it just to darken it up a little bit. Now I don't want this mix too watery. So I'm going to get that mix and start painting this eyebrow. And it comes, I always paint in the direction, if you can see the direction of something, paint in the direction that it goes. It comes around the top of the eye like this, and it has those white highlights. So I'm carefully, I've got my number 2 brush, very carefully leaving those little white highlights. I didn't know if I'd be able to get that in there, but I think I can. And then we've got the other one. The other one is quite dark grey on the right side, but it comes to more brown on the left side. So I'll start with that dark grey that I mixed. Now you can use this colour for the eyes too. And then I'm going to switch to more of the brown. This is the burnt sienna and ultramarine brown. That's a little less grey. And my number 2 brush. And as I come around this side of the eyebrow, I want it to be, it's a little bit more brown than grey. Now there's a much darker spot inside of this. I'll have to do that when this part is coming up to dry. And there's also like a dark brown sort of triangle here above that brow. And same here too. Just kind of be a little bit careful. If you get all your paint flowing together, you're going to get a bit of a mess. So you have to be just a little bit careful how you put it on. A bit of a dark brown here and under the eye. And under this side too, quite dark. And around here. And I'm putting a little bit more shadow in as this paint that I've just put on is drying. I'm putting that in. I'm leaving the very, very darks right till last. So I'm putting the eyes. We could, as long as your paint around the nostrils is dry, and mine's fairly dry, I mean it's not bone dry, but it's dry enough, I can put the light nostrils in. Now there's 2 steps to these nostrils. The the bottom of the nostril has very light colours and light grey, and then there's a really dark shadow over it. So we've got to do that in 2 parts. So I'm going to take the grey and the brown. Let's get them over here. Do a bit of mixing. A bigger brush. Always mix with a bigger brush. I'm going to get the grey and the brown, and I'm going to mix them with my other grey over here, the one that I've been using for most greys. I want a sort of a browny grey. So the first grey was Cobalt Blue and Raw Sienna and Quinacridone Rose. And then I had some burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine here. And then I had the burnt sienna ultramarine and some Payne's grey here. Now I just want to have this sort of light grey, which is a mixture of my first grey and a little bit of brown for the bottom of the nostril. So let's go in with that. We'll do the whole nostril. And then we'll come back with the dark over the top. Again, gently, gently start at the top where it's darkest, and then I've dabbed up my brush, and I'm with almost a dry brush, I'm just pulling that grey down. And same for the other nostril. Start sort of darker at the top, because we're going to put more shadow at the top when this is dry. And then coming down, drying off my brush. I have a little sponge to dry off my brush and just pull that paint down with a almost dry brush. And we've got the light grey in the nostrils. And sometimes you go back and you're like, no, this is too dark. I'm going to wash this in a little bit with a wet brush and lighten this up a little bit. And then I've kind of reached a point now where I can't work much more on the face, and I could work on the mane. I can't work on the eyes or the nostrils because it's still a little bit wet, so we got to have a little think, do I dry or do I work on the mane? Thing is, I think it's probably a good idea to dry so that I can work on all of those things at once and not have to worry. So we'll take a little break and I will do some drying. Right, let's get the eyes in. It makes such a difference once you've got eyes in the painting. So I have that lovely dark colour I've mixed up here with the Ultramarine Blue and the burnt sienna and a little bit of Payne's grey. Nice dark, not much water. When you want a nice dark colour, you don't need much water. The blue makes it a lot more like a black colour. And my little number 2 brush. And then very carefully painting in with a little tiny brush. We can use a number 1. Painting in those eyes. So I go very quiet when I'm concentrating with little tiny details like that. Always looks so much better once you get the eyes in. Everything looks better. There is a bit more eyebrow that I have to put in yet. And you can see a tiny bit of the eyelashes. Just a tiny bit. Now the eyes on the photo look fairly dark. Having a Kleenex. If you want to put any light in them, the way to do it is to put your dark on and then just suck a little bit of paint out with your thirsty brush if you want to give them just a little bit of round. The light, if there is any light reflecting on these, it's kind of at the bottom here. Just sucking a little bit with paint. Now I do need to do a little bit more to the eyebrows before that eye is finished. A bit of shadow under there. But we can do the nostrils as well, because that will help finish and make everything look right. So that same dark color that I made for the eyes, almost black, but I never use a pre-mix black. Unless if I want ink, I'll use ink. But I like to mix a lovely, vibrant, colourful, transparent or slightly transparent black. I think they're just more lively. We're going to put that shadow across the nostril. Comes in at an angle. And of course, we left a nice light grey for the bottom of the nostril. And bring that around there. Put a little bit of that black under the mouth just to accentuate it. Now, if you've got this light underneath and then the dark on the top, it really looks like the nostrils are open. And what you can do is with your little tiny brush, I'm getting some of that kind of medium grey on my little tiny brush, I'm just adding a little bit more definition to the edge of the bottom of the nostril. And I'm lightly dabbing just where it comes in a little bit darker near the black, just a tiny bit. And we get that three-dimensional look to the nostril that way. Also, now that this pink lip is dry, and I didn't get much of a soft edge on there because I was so worried about it just bleeding, I have that mid-brown on my brush, and I'm going to just dot with the tip of my little brush. I'm just going to dot that brown on a little nostril shape there. And that way I'm going to get that soft texture, but I don't have to worry about it bleeding too much in this small space. There's a little bit of, there's a couple of wrinkles too, little wrinkles here. Put those on the nose. You know, it just, their noses always feel like velvet. They always feel so beautiful. So we want to try and get that soft look. So just dotting that brown gently with the tip of my brush. Like I say, these small details, they take the time at the end. That's why I couldn't fit this video into our 2-hour lesson. It wasn't possible. It's taken me 2 days to get this video done. Well, I ran out of battery, so I had to wait to recharge my battery. I'm getting a little bit darker under the lip there, just a little bit of dark. Just wash that in with my wet brush. There, doesn't that look a little bit better once you've got the nostrils, the eyes, a little bit of texturing on the lips? And still soften that a little bit more. A little bit of brown just going around the bottom of the nostril. So not much left to do now, just really the main. The main is a really fun part at the end. I'm going to put a little bit more. This is the stage where I can put a little bit more shadow anywhere that needs it. A little bit more in the ear, a little bit more in the ear here. And going down the side of the head here, just coming up to this eyebrows a little bit darker. And there's some just features like you know, in the brow that we can put in. some dark under the eye. I'm going to soften these in, not with a wet brush, just with my brush that's had most of the paint dabbed off of it, just going in a sort of direction of the horse's face. Oh, and I was going to do a little bit of lifting, get my lifting brush. And here on the side of the face, it's a little bit lighter. I've lost a little bit of the light, so I've got my little tiny lifting brush. Any kind of little, if you get like a little brush that's meant for acrylics, a soft sort of a little brush, but harder than a watercolour brush. That kind of brush is really good for lifting, and you can do just a little bit of an agitation and a little dab with the Kleenex, and you lift a bit of light where you may have lost it, just here. And the colours we've used, the Ultramarine, the Burnt Sienna, they will all lift really easily. We can lift those off, no problem. Right, let's do the mane and let's get this guy done. Oh. I want to use that black colour that I made, and I'm going to use my liner brush, 2/0 Princeton Velvetouch liner, and I want to put some wispy mane in. I'll use a bigger brush to get the bigger parts in, but I'm going to have to turn this, I'm sorry, but I need to turn to get my wrist working in the right direction, because I want to get these wispy hairs at the top of the head. Make sure you've got a nice puddle of, don't try and mix with these beautiful thin brushes, just have a good puddle of paint mixed up that you can dip into to get the, and I'm of course like just flicking my brush in the direction of this hair. And going quite slowly. The hairs are quite short as they come off of here, and then they get a bit longer, and the direction that you flip the hair in is going to give the movement to this horse and the head of the horse. So that's the top of the head. I'm sorry, I have to twist it. I'm going to have to, sorry, twist you around again. Twist my reference photo as well so I can actually see. I'm going to do the hair coming off behind the ear. So there's these beautiful long hairs coming out here. I want to sort of almost do them individually. And sometimes you can't, you can glance at your reference photo, but if you try and follow it too precisely, you lose the spontaneous movement. So sort of try and figure out where you're going to go, and then let go of your reference for a minute and just let your hand do the work and your memory of where you saw that mane going. Because remember, every time that mane flies in the wind, it's going to fly in a different direction, as long as you get those lovely wispy hairs coming off. And you can see when you look at the reference photo that although this mane is fairly black, where the light shines through it, it looks brown. And it's lovely to have all those colours available so that you can make your mane look realistic, not just a solid black. Now as it comes across the face, I'm going to do the bigger brush in a moment as it comes across the face, because we've got a solid mass to do, but I want to do the wispy ones first, and then we'll come back and fill in the more solid ones. So let's turn that back around. We're getting some life into this horse, aren't we? I'll turn my reference photo around because it's very hard sometimes if everything's not in the right direction. Now I'm going to get my number 4 brush probably. Make sure I've got enough paint. And then we can go in with the bigger mass of mane that comes from here. We have some that's quite light. It's much easier to put this on and then lift some of the light out when it's dry. All these colours that I've mixed will lift easily. So I don't want like the wispy little parts here. This is more a solid mass of mane. So we've got a nice contrast between the light wispy ones and the more solid mass. And of course you can go back and forth. Now once I've got that on, I can go back to my little liner brush. Some people call it a rigger. It was originally called a rigger, but mostly these days they're called liners. So I call it a liner, so if anybody's going to the store looking for one, they know what to look for, because this one says script liner on it. So there, I've got the mane flying. If I wanted, I could get a little bit of raw sienna. Just a little bit of raw sienna, and I can add a few shadow hairs in the lighter colour mane coming out here. And the very last thing will be a little bit of P.H. Martin's white, just to add a few wisps like we did with the other horse. Now the very last thing I have to do is I have to get the brown eyebrows in. They're not as black as the bigger eyebrows on the top. The top's like the eye socket here, and they're more brown colour. Now I've got my burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue in it to darken it up. I'm just going to put those tops and bottom to the eye. And this one too, just a top. Going to add a little bit more of that dark in with it, just to get that kind of shape that goes around the eye correct. And there's quite a dark area here. Wet brush just to soften that edge off. I've lost a little bit of the shading down the nose, which is really important for the shape of the nose. Wet brush again, just to soften that off. And I've got an almost dry brush now. I'm just putting in a little bit of dry brush texture. And we're just about done. That felt like a real marathon painting that horse portrait. And I love doing portraits, but I think I'm used to doing them very quietly on my own, taking a few days to do it. And I found talking and filming quite a challenge. Oh, anyway, thanks for sticking with me, and thanks for waiting. I know you waited a while for your horse portrait to get finished. Hopefully it'll be helpful to watch this. I know I saw some yesterday that people had done and they looked beautiful. So there's my first one I did next to my second one, and I think my first one had a bit more movement in the mane. I might need, I'm looking at my first one thinking I need a little bit more swish in that mane, a little bit more swish here, I think. And that's another thing that I can work on afterwards. And I don't know if I have my pastel pencil available. I should have made it available to myself, but I don't think I did. But I quite often use a white pastel pencil just to give a little bit of texture to the white. I'll go look for it and show you that just before we finish. So while I was looking for my pastel pencil, I dried the painting and I took the tape off, and now I have pastel pencils in a number of colors, and they're very useful. They work very well on watercolor paper, and I can do things like get a little bit of that shine back to the coat where I couldn't keep that. You can smudge them a little bit with your finger. There's a whole shine around here, and there's a little bit of shine on the eyebrow there, and here under the eye, just those little tiny details. And a pastel pencil, very inexpensive. A little bit of shine on the nostril. They only cost a couple of dollars, and this one's General's white, but there's several makes of pastel pencil that you can get. And of course, it's if you're a purist and you're entering some kind of a competition, it's mixed media once you get the pastel on. But if you just like doing your painting for fun, or for yourself, for a gift, to give it to someone who loves horses, you know, don't worry about using a bit of pastel or a bit of P.H. Martin's white on your painting. So I can just get some of those really soft lights back, and you can smudge with a smudge tool or your finger. I don't like to put my finger on my painting while I'm painting, but when it's all finished and this is just the pastel, I'm not worried about that. And I've seen really good painters use the pastel. So I could use the pastel to put that little bit of light grey in the mane where it catches the light, or I could lift the paint off. I kind of like the look of the pastel pencil. It's lovely and soft. You can get a soft edge to this hair here. I also have a pink pastel pencil upstairs, so I could soften the lip with that. Really useful. And of course the other useful thing is the P.H. Martin's white. And I've used the pastel pencil on both of these because it's lovely and soft, and gives those beautiful soft highlights. I first saw James Gurney use it to make a sort of a haze around the sun, and it looks so beautiful. And it was the first time I realized you don't have to just stick to watercolor. He's a very, very professional painter, illustrates books and all kinds of things, and he's not worried about using a little bit of pastel in his painting. So there we go. I've got a few more lovely highlights that I couldn't get easily with the paint on a small painting. So thank you for being patient. Thank you for joining me. And I have a few more videos to make, so stand by, wait for a week, and there'll be some more. Thank you so much. See you next time. How did your painting go? Did you do a painting of a horse? I think that was quite tricky. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.